He looked me straight in the eye, lifted his glass, and said with a smirk, "Your daughter married into real power." You should be grateful. The laughter that followed cut deeper than any blade. In that moment, I realized silence was no longer strength. It was surrender. What happened next turned an evening of mockery into the night their empire began to crumble. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. The first light of dawn always has a way of softening the ridges of the Rockies, even from my small ranch outside Denver. I stood at the kitchen counter, waiting for the coffee maker to finish its slow drip, and breathed in the faint trace of lilac air freshener that still lingered years after my wife passed. I never replaced it. Some mornings it seemed like her presence filled the house through that simple scent, reminding me that life's best things aren't loud or glittering. They're steady, quiet, and deeply personal. After breakfast, my routine unfolded with the precision of a clock. I fed the hens that scratched impatiently at the coop door, scattered grain for the old horse that had seen better days, and checked the irrigation lines along the west field. These small rituals anchored me. I'd once run a medtech company in Chicago where every hour felt like a storm of deadlines, mergers, and negotiations. I sold it at the right moment and walked away with more money than I could ever spend. Yet I found my peace not in skyscrapers or luxury penthouses, but in this land, in the scrape of boots against gravel and the rhythmic creak of barn doors. My fortune remained a secret by design. I still drove a dented pickup that coughed when I turned the ignition. My shirts were patched, my boots were sold more times than I cared to admit, and my furniture bore the comfortable wear of decades. Wealth hadn't spoiled me. If anything, it had deepened my mistrust of extravagance. I learned long ago that the flashiest man in the room often had the weakest footing. Respect, once earned, outlasted applause or shiny baubles. I walked back into the house and paused at the mantel. The photo of my wife smiled back at me, her eyes crinkling the way they always did when she found me reading the paper at the table. One chair at the dining set stayed empty, and I never let anyone sit there. Grief had transformed into ritual, not spectacle, but it reminded me every day of the promise I had made, to protect Emily, our daughter, and to show up for her in every way I could. Emily had always been ambitious, curious, and quick to learn. I made sure she had what she needed, but I never let money speak louder than her own effort. She earned scholarships, carried herself with pride, and eventually earned her law degree. My calls with her had grown shorter since her marriage to Mark Reynolds, a polished Houston attorney with a jawline fit for magazines and a family steeped in country club tradition. I met him twice, polite, distracted, always glancing at his watch as though somewhere else mattered more. His parents, Catherine and Thomas Reynolds, were the embodiment of Southern old guard wealth. Charity boards, galas, designer wardrobes, and a sharp sense of who belonged and who didn't. A week ago, a cream-colored envelope had arrived, embossed with the Reynolds crest. Inside was an invitation to an intimate family evening. Emily texted me quickly after, "Just family, Dad. It would mean a lot if you came." I circled the date on the kitchen calendar, right next to the reminder to pick up feed. My pulse quickened at the thought of meeting her new family properly. The Reynolds world was foreign territory to me, all chandeliers and measured smiles, but if it mattered to Emily, I would go. On the morning of the trip, I stood before my wardrobe, fingers brushing past wool jackets and neatly folded shirts. I chose a clean white shirt, pressed until it carried faint creases, and a brown sport coat I had owned for years. My Oxfords had been resoled twice, but they shone respectably after a polish. No cufflinks, no tie pin, no outward sign of wealth. The only thing I tucked into my pocket was a pressed linen handkerchief. My wife had always insisted a man should carry one, and a folded program from Emily's college graduation, creased from being opened so many times. The drive toward the airport felt like tracing the chapters of my life. The mountains shrank in the rearview mirror, giving way to the flat sweep of highway. I thought of those long years in Chicago, boardrooms that smelled of coffee and ambition, conference calls that stretched past midnight. Precision and patience had built my fortune, but they also taught me restraint. I had never flaunted wealth because real strength was in silence and control. By the time the plane touched down in Houston, I had rehearsed the small talk I might need. Gardens, college football, the sweltering Texas heat. I wasn't aiming to impress them. I wanted only to make Emily proud, to stand at her side without being a shadow or a burden. My stakes were never financial. They were emotional, her sense of belonging, her comfort among people who thought in terms of legacy and lineage. The rideshare pulled up in front of the Reynolds estate just as twilight settled over the city. The house glowed with warm lights, its columns gleaming like marble in the dusk. I stepped out slowly, adjusted my jacket, and touched the folded graduation program in my pocket. Breathing deeply, I steadied myself. The evening was about to unfold, and though I had no illusions about fitting into their world, I would walk through those doors with quiet dignity, carrying every promise I had ever made to Emily and to the woman whose picture still guarded my mantle back home. If you're still watching and felt the weight of that quiet beginning, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's step into the moment where small cracks begin to show. The Houston air wrapped around me like a damp cloth as I climbed the stone steps of the Reynolds estate. The heavy wooden doors towered overhead, their brass handles polished until they gleamed like gold in the porch lights. A valet in a crisp jacket whisked away my coat with a silent nod, and before I could settle my shoulders, I was swallowed by the hum of voices and the faint strains of piano drifting from within. The foyer smelled faintly of polished wood and citrus oil, a practiced welcome designed to announce refinement before a word was spoken. Crystal chandeliers poured light over marble floors, and the first thing I noticed were the portraits. Generations of Reynolds men gazed down in tailored suits, their wives in pearls and satin gowns, painted to suggest an unbroken chain of influence. It wasn't subtle. Every detail of the house whispered, "This is a family that has belonged at the top for a long time." I caught the faintest shift in the room when I entered, a handful of heads turning, as if to register how far from those portraits I appeared. Emily appeared almost instantly, her smile wide, though her eyes told a different story. She reached up to straighten the collar of my sport coat, her fingers brushing my shoulder with nervous urgency. "Dad, please," she whispered, barely moving her lips. "Just try to get along tonight." I squeezed her hand gently, more to steady her than myself. "Always, Em," I murmured back. She held my gaze for half a heartbeat, then slipped away toward her husband, her back straight, her shoulders taut, as if she carried both families' expectations at once. From the corner of my eye, Catherine Reynolds swept into view. She was a striking woman in an emerald silk gown that shimmered as she moved, her hair pinned in immaculate waves, her diamonds glinting like warning lights. She leaned in with a smile, the kind that is all teeth and no warmth. "Richard, so glad you could join us," she said, her voice pitched just high enough for those nearest to catch every word. "Emily tells me you live quite simply these days." The pause she left after "simply" was not accidental. A faint ripple of amusement spread among the guests within earshot. I returned her smile with a calm nod, refusing to let the barb find its mark. "I manage well enough," I said evenly, but her eyes had already moved on, scanning the crowd for the next set of ears to impress. It didn't take long for the whispers to grow legs. A cousin of Mark leaned toward his date, his smirk sharp under the chandelier glow. "He looks like he stepped off a farm truck," he muttered, loud enough to carry. She covered her mouth as if stifling a laugh, though her eyes shone with the thrill of shared mockery. The sound flickered through the room like a match catching dry tinder. Subtle chuckles, sidelong glances, the unspoken conclusion that I was an outsider in boots resolved too many times. I felt the old urge to bite back, to dismantle arrogance with a scalpel edge of words. But I heard my wife's voice in memory. "Dignity is your shield, Richard." So I swallowed the reply and let the silence stand. Silence unsettles people more than anger ever does. A bell chimed softly as servers moved through the crowd with champagne flutes. Mark stepped onto a small platform near the grand staircase, raising his glass high. His smile was flawless, rehearsed, his tone carrying the practiced authority of a courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight is more than family. It is about legacy. Our firm is preparing to secure a $50 million joint venture that will cement our position at the forefront of Houston business." Applause rippled through the room. Catherine beamed as though the words themselves were a coronation. Emily clapped politely, her eyes darting between her husband and the approving faces of his relatives. I joined in with 2 measured taps of my palm against the glass, watching instead of celebrating. Then I heard it, just a name carried on Mark's lowered voice as he leaned to a colleague. Coleman Capital, my own creation, the fund I had formed quietly after selling my company. For years, it had moved behind trusts and managers, shielded from public recognition. Yet here was my son-in-law, boasting of a deal he believed would guarantee his family's dominance, never realizing that the man standing ignored in the corner was the very signature on that contract. I sipped the champagne, letting the irony rest on my tongue like bitter fruit. They thought me small, provincial, irrelevant. They had no idea the string they dangled so proudly was one I could cut with a flick of my wrist. Later, I drifted onto the back patio, the humid air pressing against my shirt. The garden stretched in manicured perfection, hedges trimmed like soldiers, roses glowing under lanterns. Through the glass doors I could see the laughter, the clinking glasses, the whirl of silk gowns. Their world spun on confidence and assumption, convinced of its own permanence. I touched the folded program from Emily's graduation in my pocket, grounding myself. Tonight, I would remain silent. But silence was not surrender. It was patience. And patience, I knew better than most, always won. The hum of conversation inside the Reynolds estate deepened as the evening stretched on. The air was thicker now, heavy, not just with humidity drifting through the open terrace doors, but with a new current of confidence in the room. Guests had moved beyond polite small talk. With each glass of wine, their words grew louder, their jokes sharper, and I could feel the weight of eyes turning toward me more openly. What had begun as subtle glances and half-hidden whispers had blossomed into outright ridicule. I stood near the edge of the sitting room, holding a glass of water rather than champagne. From there, I could observe without being drawn into their circles. The chandeliers reflected in the polished marble floor, and for a moment I caught the image of a man who did not belong, a man they dismissed without hesitation. The laughter behind me snapped me back. One of Mark's younger cousins, no more than 25, raised his voice deliberately, making sure the words carried across the room. "I bet Mr. Coleman thinks McDonald's is fine dining." His friends burst into laughter, a sharp juvenile chorus that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The cousin grinned, reveling in the attention, and glanced toward me with smug satisfaction. I did not flinch. Years of boardrooms, hostile negotiations, and medical crises had trained me to school my face into calm. But inside my chest I felt the sting. Not because of the insult itself, I had endured worse in life, but because of what it represented. They had stopped pretending. Catherine, seated elegantly near the fireplace, swirled her champagne and lifted her voice as though making a toast. "At least Emily won't inherit her father's sense of style," she said sweetly. Her earrings glittered in the firelight, her smile wide and rehearsed. Laughter bubbled again, richer this time, as if her approval gave permission to unleash cruelty unchecked. A man in a tailored gray suit leaned against the piano, adding his own jab. "Imagine negotiating billion-dollar cases with a father-in-law who still wears farm boots." He chuckled, and the circle around him erupted in agreement. I glanced down at my polished Oxfords, old but clean, and the comment hung in the air like smoke. Across the room, Emily sat beside Mark, her champagne flute trembling slightly in her hand. She stared into the glass, her lips pressed together, her shoulders drawn tight. I knew that look. She was torn, trapped between loyalty to me and the crushing pressure to align with the family she had married into. My heart ached more for her silence than for their laughter. I turned my eyes toward Mark, hoping for a word, even a gesture, to soften the blows. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, grinning faintly. "Dad does things his own way," he said, his tone light, teasing, but the next words cut deeper than any insult from the others. "He's different from us." The crowd laughed as though he had delivered a clever punchline. It was betrayal wrapped in civility. My own son-in-law, the man I had welcomed into my daughter's life, was signaling that I was beneath them, not an equal, but a curiosity to be laughed at. My grip on the water glass tightened, and I forced myself to loosen it before the tension betrayed me. As the room shifted toward another round of champagne, Mark began again, voice pitched with pride. He spoke of the future, of opportunities that would secure the Reynolds family name for decades. "This $50 million deal," he announced, "is only the beginning. It will cement our reputation at the top of Houston's business world." He basked in the admiring murmurs, enjoying the role of visionary. Then I heard it again, slipped into conversation as he leaned to a colleague, Coleman Capital. The name struck me like a chord played too loudly in a quiet room. My fund, my creation. The very deal he bragged about was mine to approve or destroy. The irony was so sharp I almost laughed, but I held it back, letting the knowledge burn quietly inside me. They mocked me to my face while boasting of power they believed belonged to them. In truth, it rested in my hands. That was the moment the humiliation transformed. Their laughter no longer merely wounded, it sharpened my resolve. I raised my eyes and caught Emily's reflection in the glass of the cabinet nearby. She looked fragile, smaller somehow, under the weight of expectation. I wanted to walk to her, to put my hand on her shoulder and remind her she had nothing to prove. But I stayed still, holding my silence as carefully as one holds a blade before the strike. When the laughter died down, I set my empty glass on the tray of a passing waiter. My hand lingered for a second, steadying myself. Across the room, I saw my reflection again, caught in the mirror above the bar. An older man in a modest coat, regarded as insignificant. But I knew better. I was not insignificant. I was patient. And patience, I reminded myself, is the sharpest weapon of all. The party swirled on, oblivious. They believed they had placed me in my place. What they did not know was that the contract they paraded so proudly already rested beneath my pen, and when the time came, I would show them exactly who I was. The crowd inside the Reynolds home had grown looser as the evening wore on. Wine had smoothed their tongues, and laughter no longer carried the veil of courtesy. Small clusters of people stood near the grand staircase, the polished bar, the outdoor patio doors. Their voices wove through the air like threads of mockery, stitching me into a caricature that was easier to laugh at than to understand. I had spent most of the evening listening, watching, letting their barbs slide off me like rain on wax, but eventually, I saw Emily standing near the hallway, her shoulders tight, her smile brittle. I stepped toward her, weaving between the guests. When I reached her side, I lowered my voice so only she could hear. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" She glanced away, her eyes darting toward Mark across the room. "I'm fine, Dad," she said quickly. Too quickly. Her hand fidgeted with the edge of her clutch. I tried again, softer this time. "Doesn't this bother you? The way they talk?" Her lips pressed together, and for a moment I thought she might break, but then she shook her head, eyes downcast. "Please, just let it go tonight. Don't make it worse." Those words cut deeper than all the laughter in the room. My daughter, the one I had raised with every ounce of effort after her mother died, was asking me to swallow the humiliation for the sake of peace. I wanted to tell her she deserved better, that silence in the face of cruelty is its own betrayal, but her expression, tired, pleading, stopped me. I nodded once, though my heart felt heavier than before. When I returned to the crowd, the noise struck sharper. A woman in pearls commented loudly that my jacket looked vintage in the charitable sense. A man with slicked hair and a martini smirked. You can tell he drove here in a pickup. Probably with hay in the back, laughter bloomed around him. Their eyes flicked toward me not with curiosity, but with certainty. They had placed me in a box, and they enjoyed shaking it. Mark took his place near the bar, drawing attention easily, his charisma natural when he was surrounded by people eager to admire him. He spoke animatedly about the Reynolds firm's future, the new partnership that would expand their reach. "This deal is transformative," he declared, raising his glass. Then he turned slightly toward me with a half smile. "Of course, Emily's father here has always been a man of simpler means. But sometimes life gives us the chance to move up, doesn't it?" The room chuckled. Mark's friends leaned closer, whispering, their grins widening. My jaw tightened. To them, his words were a gentle jest, but I heard the truth beneath. He did not see me as family, only as a relic Emily would eventually shed. I swallowed my pride again, clinging to the lessons I had repeated in my mind since the start of the night. Dignity is your shield. Anger is their victory. Still, with every joke, every smirk, every glance that stripped me of worth, I felt the edges of that shield bending. Catherine's voice rang out above the chatter as she tapped her glass with a manicured nail. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" she said with a smile broad enough to command attention. "Emily has truly found her place here. In time, I'm sure she'll forget those rougher roots. After all, everyone must rise above where they came from." Her gaze swept over me like a blade. The laughter that followed was louder, freer, emboldened by her approval. I could see Emily across the room, her hands folded tightly, her face pale. She said nothing. I turned toward the patio doors and stepped outside, letting the night air cool my skin. The garden stretched in geometric perfection, roses pruned like soldiers. My hands gripped the balcony rail, knuckles white. Inside, their laughter rolled on. My silence had been interpreted as weakness, not restraint. They believed I had no voice, no worth, no power, but I knew better. Through the open doorway, Mark's voice carried again. He was speaking to a small group of colleagues, the words swelling with pride. "Coleman Capital has agreed in principle. Once it's signed, the Reynolds name will be cemented for decades. We'll control the strings. Coleman Capital. My creation, my money, my approval." I leaned against the rail, the humid air thick in my lungs. The irony was almost unbearable. They mocked me while bragging about a future they thought they owned, blind to the fact that it rested entirely in my hands. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply stood there, quiet, letting patience harden into something sharper. The evening had changed. I was no longer a guest enduring humiliation. I was a man biding his time, waiting for the exact moment when silence would become revelation. The Reynolds estate glowed brighter than usual that evening. Lanterns lined the driveway, and the hum of voices carried out onto the lawn, where valets parked luxury cars in neat rows. Inside, the great hall swelled with bodies, laughter, and the kind of polished bravado that thrives when the wealthy gather to admire one another. It was a celebration disguised as an intimate family affair, though I could tell the real purpose was to showcase the Reynolds name. I walked in quietly, shoulders squared, my coat brushed and shoes shined, but I felt the difference immediately. Tonight was sharper. People no longer needed to whisper behind glasses. They spoke more openly, emboldened by the size of the audience. A man near the entrance lifted his drink and chuckled. Emily's dad parked a truck out front. I thought the HOA had rules about that sort of thing. His friends laughed with him, their eyes sliding over to gauge my reaction. I gave none. Further in, the chandeliers rained gold light down onto silk gowns and pressed suits. Catherine Reynolds stood near the staircase, her gown sweeping like a banner across the floor. She smiled sweetly at her circle, her voice pitched to carry across the hall. "Our Emily has risen above her background beautifully," she said. "With time, she'll learn to leave the past, and certain people, behind." Her glass lifted in mock salute. Laughter rolled through the room like a wave. I glanced toward Emily. She sat beside Mark, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She would not meet my gaze. My heart clenched. She was caught between worlds, afraid to lose either, and it left her paralyzed. Mark leaned back in his chair, laughing along with his colleagues. Then he added lightly, "Well, every family has its quirks. Ours is just better suited for the future." The words were meant as a jest, but they landed like a hammer. A ripple of laughter followed, and I felt the sting not only as a man, but as a father. I set my glass down, the rim clicking sharply against the table. My breath came slow and measured, but inside something shifted. All night, I had told myself to endure. Patience is your shield. Silence is your strength. But silence had turned me into their punchline, and every chuckle carved deeper into Emily's sense of belonging. For the first time, I felt not just anger, but the raw humiliation of being dismissed in front of my own child. The evening reached its crescendo when Catherine tapped her glass again, calling for attention. Her diamonds caught the chandelier light as she lifted her voice. "Tonight is not only about family," she announced, "but about legacy. I am thrilled to share that the Reynolds firm is finalizing a partnership with Coleman Capital worth $50 million. Applause thundered through the hall. Guests raised their glasses, some clapping, others cheering. Pride bloomed across Catherine's face, and Mark basked in the glow as though he himself had secured the deal. I heard my name, the name I had hidden behind the corporate veil, used like a trophy in their parade. They celebrated my work, my money, my company, while mocking me to my face as if I were nothing. My chest tightened. I gripped to the edge of the table to steady myself. The irony was almost unbearable. They boasted about power they thought belonged to them while tearing me down with every word. They laughed at the man who, in truth, controlled the strings of their future. I felt eyes on me again. Some were curious, others mocking, a few dismissive. Catherine's gaze lingered, her lips curled into a smirk, as if daring me to object. She believed I was powerless, that my silence was permanent. I returned her stare, not with anger, but with something steadier, colder. The storm inside me had reached its peak. I stood straighter, squaring my shoulders, my resolve hardening. They had pushed far enough. This was no longer about my pride. It was about Emily, about the promise I had made to her mother that our daughter would never stand alone in shame. If the Reynolds family believed they had reduced me to dust, they would soon learn that silence can break louder than any shout. Conversations swirled back around me, but I did not move. I placed my glass firmly on the tray of a passing waiter, the sound of its landing sharper than I intended. A few heads turned, momentarily startled. Then the laughter resumed. They thought that the moment had passed. But it hadn't. I stood in the middle of that glittering hall, no longer the man shrinking at the edges. The breaking point had arrived, and though no one realized it yet, the tide of the evening had already shifted. The hall still buzzed with the aftershocks of Catherine's announcement. Glasses clinked, and the guest chatter rose in waves of excitement. They spoke of the Reynolds family as if they had already ascended to a higher throne, their voices laced with admiration and envy. I stood near the edge of the room, watching the spectacle unfold, my silence wrapping around me like armor. Yet inside, I could feel the storm pressing harder against the walls I had built. For months I had guarded my identity, convinced that patience was the nobler path, that humility would shield both me and Emily from the sharp edges of society's cruelty. But as I listened to them toast to their triumph, their arrogance swelling on the back of my work and my money, I realized silence no longer protected Emily, it chained her to their derision. Adrian, one of the senior partners at the Reynolds firm, approached me with the smirk of a man who believed himself untouchable. He held his champagne flute like a trophy. "You must be proud, Richard," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Your daughter married into real power." I offered him a calm nod, though the insult struck with precision. Before I could turn away, another guest leaned in, his laughter oily. "This deal will finally give the Reynolds family the stature they deserve. Some people here are just lucky to witness it." He didn't need to clarify who he meant. The laughter of his companions filled in the blanks. My hand tightened around the stem of my glass. The temptation to shatter it against the marble floor was strong, but I held steady. Rage would only feed their narrative. Yet, in that moment, I knew restraint alone would not be enough. Then Emily appeared at my side. Her presence startled me more than the jeers. She placed her hand on my arm, her eyes wide, her voice barely audible. "Dad, please," she whispered. "Don't do anything. Just let it pass." Her words, filled with desperation, were a dagger of a different kind. She was torn between her love for me and her fear of this family's scorn. I could feel the tremor in her fingers. I wanted to shield her, to protect her from the cruel theater unfolding around us. Yet, I saw something else too, her shame. If I stayed silent, that shame would fester, and she would carry it long after the champagne had gone flat. I looked into her eyes and, for the first time that night, understood with clarity that this wasn't about me. It was about her. Every insult hurled at me left a mark on her too, teaching her that her father was a man who could be dismissed, mocked, and ignored. If I allowed that lie to stand, she would forever carry the burden of their laughter. I released her hand gently. "It's all right," I whispered. "Trust me." She shook her head faintly, fear tightening her jaw, but I turned away. My choice had already been made. I slipped my hand into the inside pocket of my jacket, brushing my fingers against the smooth surface of my phone. It hummed with quiet promise, the weight of truth resting there. One press of a button could unravel the empire they bragged about. Around me, laughter swelled again as Mark held court, retelling the story of their soon-to-be triumph. I straightened my shoulders, every movement deliberate. Years of boardrooms had taught me how to command silence without raising my voice. Tonight, that lesson would serve me well. I stepped forward into the center of the hall. The piano's gentle melody faltered, the notes hanging unfinished as the player sensed the shift. Conversation slowed, then stilled. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, curiosity sparking. I could feel the weight of Catherine's gaze pressing hardest. She smirked, as though certain I would embarrass myself with some clumsy protest. I raised my chin and let the silence stretch, every second a tightening rope around their pride. Then I cleared my throat, my voice, steady and firm, cut through the hush like a verdict. "You've celebrated long enough," I said, my eyes sweeping across the room. "Now it's time you heard the truth." The effect was immediate. Glasses froze midair. Mark's smile faltered. Emily covered her lips with her hand. The room, moments ago brimming with arrogance, seemed to shrink around me. Inside, I felt a calm I hadn't known all evening. The choice was behind me now. Silence had ended. Truth was about to begin. The silence that followed my words was heavier than any insult they had thrown at me all night. A moment ago, the hall had pulsed with laughter, chatter, and champagne glasses clinking like cymbals. Now, it seemed even the chandeliers held their breath. Every eye was fixed on me, the man they thought was little more than an unwanted guest, standing at the center of their glittering world. I drew my phone from my jacket pocket, the movement slow, deliberate. For months I had guarded this truth. Tonight, restraint had run its course. With a press of my thumb, the screen lit up, and the hall's projector, set earlier for family slideshows, flared to life. On the white canvas stretched across the far wall, bold letters appeared in crisp clarity. Coleman Capital officially cancels the $50 million partnership with the Reynolds firm due to ethical concerns. The words hung there, larger than life, stark against the glittering backdrop of chandeliers and gowns. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then came the gasps. Catherine's hand flew to her chest, her diamond necklace trembling against her skin. Her face drained of color, the confident glow she had worn only moments ago dissolving into disbelief. "No," she whispered, though the word was swallowed by the rising tide of murmurs. Mark's smile cracked like glass under pressure. He blinked rapidly, his jaw working soundlessly, before he finally sputtered. This has to be some kind of mistake. Richard, what are you—" But the rest of his words dissolved into the growing panic of the room. Adrian, the smug partner who had cornered me earlier, stumbled backward. His champagne glass slipped from his hand, shattering across the marble floor. The sharp crack of breaking crystal echoed like a gunshot, sending a ripple of unease through the guests. Whispers spread like wildfire. "He's Coleman Capital?" one woman hissed to her husband. "Did you hear what it says?" The deal's gone. Phones lit up across the room, the glow of dozens of screens confirming the truth. Alerts had already hit the wires. The cancellation was public, irreversible, undeniable. I watched as pride drained from the Reynolds family in real time. Investors who had been clapping moments earlier now pulled out their phones, muttering frantically into them. A man who had toasted Catherine barely 5 minutes ago excused himself, slipping out a side door, unwilling to be associated with what was clearly a sinking ship. Through it all, I remained calm. My voice did not rise, my expression did not gloat. Strength was not found in shouting or in vengeance. It was found in the steadiness to stand in the storm and not flinch. Emily stood near the staircase, her eyes wide, her lips parted. Shock rippled across her face. Not the shame of earlier, but something deeper, more conflicted. She looked at me as though seeing me for the first time, realizing the man she had believed to be simple, almost fragile, had undone an empire in a single act. I could read the emotions flickering across her features, pride, fear, and the weight of understanding. The room devolved into chaos. Catherine clutched at her pearls, demanding answers no one could give. Mark tried to rally the attention of a few allies, but their faces had already shifted into masks of calculation. They weren't thinking about him anymore. They were thinking about how to distance themselves. Adrian stood pale and sweating, his hands shaking as he bent to pick up the shards of his glass, though the act seemed more like desperation than duty. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, my movements steady. Around me, the empire that had mocked me only minutes before was collapsing, brick by brick, in full view of everyone they had once impressed. My silence had been mistaken for weakness, but now it spoke louder than any words could. The headlines were already writing themselves. I could hear the murmurs. Reynolds' firm loses $50 million deal in scandal. Coleman Capital CEO reveals true identity. Family humiliated at their own celebration. Each whisper carved deeper into the Reynolds' reputation, stripping away the illusions they had built. Emily's gaze found mine again. She didn't smile, didn't move closer, but her eyes softened with something unspoken. She finally understood. This wasn't vengeance for the sake of ego. It was justice. Calm, deliberate, undeniable. I took a slow breath, the first real breath I had allowed myself all evening. The weight on my chest lifted. For the first time that night, I felt relief. Not triumph, not gloating, just the quiet certainty that truth had been delivered and the balance had been restored. Around me, the Reynolds' glittering hall was no longer a place of grandeur. It had become a stage of consequences, and I, the man they had dismissed as irrelevant, had just closed the curtain on their performance. The glitter of the Reynolds estate had dimmed. What had begun as a triumphant celebration now resembled the aftermath of a storm. Guests no longer mingled freely. They moved in hurried currents toward the exits, whispering to one another, as if the house itself had turned toxic. Some offered brief apologies as they slipped by me, not out of genuine remorse, but to shield themselves from association. The once proud family now stood exposed in their own hall, cornered by the truth they could no longer laugh away. Mark was the first to approach. His face was drained of the confidence that had carried him all night. The handsome composure he wore, like armor, had cracked, revealing panic beneath. He raised his hands as if to steady himself, then lowered them again, uncertain. "Please," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. "We can fix this. Just restore the deal. I still respect you as my father-in-law." The words rang hollow. Respect spoken only after humiliation isn't respect at all. It is fear disguised as civility. His colleagues, still lingering nearby, shifted uncomfortably. They could see the performance for what it was. Then Catherine stepped forward. The woman who had spent the evening raising her glass at my expense no longer had the poise of Houston society. Her emerald gown seemed to swallow her face pale, her eyes rimmed red. She tried to muster grace, but her voice trembled with desperation. "Richard," she began, forcing the words through her tight throat, "we were mistaken. We spoke out of turn. Please, overlook this evening." Her smile wavered, brittle as glass, a mask that collapsed even as she wore it. For a moment I looked at her, at the cracks in the veneer she had built so carefully. My answer came with no flourish, no rage, only finality. "Respect isn't begged for after it's destroyed," I said calmly. "It's shown long before." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause they had ever received. Some guests lowered their eyes. Others watched with grim fascination, aware that they were witnessing not just the collapse of a deal, but the death of a reputation. Phones glowed discreetly at the edges of the room, capturing the downfall for headlines that would spread by morning. And then, in the middle of it all, Emily found her voice. She had stood silent for too long, caught between love for her father and loyalty to the family she had married into. Now the pressure broke, not with hysteria, but with trembling clarity. She stepped forward, her voice shaking at first, but growing stronger as she spoke. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her eyes sweeping the room before landing on Mark. "I can't stay in a marriage where my father is humiliated, where he's treated as less than nothing. I won't live like this." The words hit harder than the contract cancellation. The room shifted, guests murmuring as they watched the unraveling extend beyond business into blood and bone. Mark's face hardened, his desperation twisting into anger, but he didn't speak. He knew nothing he said could undo what had been laid bare. I felt a pang in my chest, sorrow for Emily's pain, even in this moment of vindication. She had loved him once, enough to stand silent against her better judgment. Now she saw the truth, that love built on shame cannot last. My late wife's words came back to me as clearly as if she stood beside me. Teach her respect, teach her dignity, show her that silence is not the same as peace. Around us, the chaos continued. Adrian fumbled with his phone, sweat beading on his forehead, as he tried to salvage what couldn't be saved. Investors excused themselves with curt nods. A reporter slipped out the side door, already composing the headline in her mind. The Reynolds empire was breaking beyond repair, and all of Houston would know by morning. I placed a steady hand on Emily's shoulder. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, but her expression resolute. Together we turned toward the exit. The marble floor that had once seemed cold and unforgiving now felt lighter beneath my steps. For the first time all evening, I felt no weight pressing down on me, only clarity. The Reynolds empire had crumbled, but Emily and I were walking into something stronger than wealth or reputation. We were walking into truth, into dignity, into freedom from their poison. And as the doors of the grand hall closed behind us, I knew the night had not destroyed us. It had freed us. The morning after the confrontation felt eerily calm. The chaos of the Reynolds estate, the shattering of champagne glasses, the gasps of guests. It all seemed distant as I stood once more on my ranch outside Denver. The air was cool, the sky painted with the soft lavender of dawn, and the only sounds were the rustling of hens impatient for their feed. I scattered the grain across the ground, watching them peck and flutter, the simple rhythm of life grounding me after a night that had altered everything. News traveled faster than the sunrise. By the time I poured my first cup of coffee, headlines had already spread across Houston and beyond. Reynolds deal collapses in scandal. Coleman Capital CEO revealed as humiliated father-in-law. Family fortune crumbles overnight. Each headline carried the weight of finality. For years, the Reynolds family had cultivated an image of refinement, superiority, and untouchable influence. In one evening, that illusion was gone. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where my wife and I had once shared meals, and opened the paper on my tablet. The details matched what I had seen unfold. Catherine Reynolds quietly dropped from charity boards. Her invitations to society luncheons rescinded without ceremony. Mark's law practice already felt the tremors as clients distanced themselves from his arrogance and poor judgment. Adrian, whose smirk had seemed carved in stone, was officially ousted from the Reynolds firm, his reputation tattered beyond repair. I should have felt triumph, but what I felt instead was relief, tempered by sorrow. Watching the collapse of people who had mocked me wasn't satisfying, it was sobering. Their downfall was their own doing, born of pride and cruelty. I had simply lifted the veil. The ranch offered the quiet I needed to process. I walked to the field slowly, boots pressing into soft earth, the smell of hay and soil comforting me more than any luxury ever could. The horizon stretched endlessly, reminding me that life goes on, no matter how loud the storms of society rage. I breathed deeply, grateful for the steadiness of the land, for the quiet strength it had always given me. By afternoon, a car pulled up the long gravel drive. I recognized it instantly. Emily stepped out, her hair pulled back, her eyes weary but resolute. She carried 2 suitcases, their weight dragging on her arms, but the burden on her face seemed heavier still. I met her halfway, and for a moment neither of us spoke. She set the bags down and looked at me with trembling lips. "I left him," she said simply. I studied her eyes, searching for hesitation. But what I saw there was clarity, painful but true. "Are you sure?" I asked softly. She nodded. "I can't live in a marriage where my own father is humiliated." I thought keeping the peace meant staying silent, but all it did was make me smaller. I should have spoken sooner. Her voice cracked, but she stood straighter as she continued. "I won't let anyone treat you that way again. And I won't let them define me either." Pride surged in me, mingled with sorrow for what she had endured. I reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You found your voice when it mattered," I said. "That's more than most ever do." We carried her bags inside, placing them by the staircase. She sank into the chair across from mine at the kitchen table, the same seat she had filled as a little girl doing homework while I reviewed company ledgers. The folded graduation program still rested in my jacket pocket, worn from years of carrying it, but now it felt different. No longer a reminder of what I needed to protect. It was a promise I had kept. The afternoon light streamed through the windows as we sat together in quiet. No need for grand speeches. She had chosen dignity over pretense, truth over comfort. My wife would have been proud. I could almost hear her voice, reminding me that respect isn't given by others. It is claimed by standing firm. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the fields. The Reynolds name, once spoken with reverence in Houston, now lingered only in whispers as a cautionary tale. Their empire had crumbled in a single night. But here, at this table, father and daughter were stronger than ever. As dusk settled, I stepped onto the porch, Emily by my side. We watched the horizon together, the last light of day stretching across the land. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, the air was clear. The Reynolds family had lost their legacy. We had found ours. Several weeks passed, and life at the ranch settled back into its natural rhythm. Each morning I rose before the sun, the air crisp with the scent of dew and hay, and poured myself a cup of black coffee at the same kitchen table I had sat at for decades. The hens clamored for feed, the horse whinnied for attention, and the world beyond my fields continued to chatter about the downfall of the Reynolds family. Yet here, time moved at its own pace, calm and steady. The newspapers in Houston had not been kind. Every headline seemed to sharpen the blade. Reynolds' legacy in ruins, charity circles drop. Catherine Reynolds, law firm loses clients after scandal. Their empire had not simply cracked, it had disintegrated. People who once toasted their names now spoke of them as a warning, a parable of arrogance and pride. I did not revel in it, though. Watching people fall always carries more sorrow than satisfaction. They had written their own ending. I had only revealed the truth. I sat at the table one morning, the folded graduation program resting near my coffee mug, and thought about the journey. I had endured sneers, whisperers, and outright laughter. I had swallowed humiliation until my silence became its own prison. Yet, in one moment, I chose to end it, not for my pride, but for Emily's dignity. That choice had changed everything. Silence can protect, but there comes a time when silence must give way to action, or it ceases to serve honor. Emily was proof of that. She had grown stronger since leaving Mark. I watched her find her footing, slowly building her own career with the same determination she once used to study late into the night at this very table. She spoke now with conviction, her voice no longer timid. When neighbors asked about Houston, she answered firmly, refusing to let shame dictate her story. I could see in her eyes a new steadiness, the kind born not from ease, but from walking through fire and emerging whole. One evening, I stood at the mantel where my wife's photograph still rested. The lines of her face, the warmth in her smile, had faded slightly with time, but the memory of her voice was as clear as ever. I whispered softly, "I kept my promise. Emily knows her worth. She will never bow her head in shame again." My grief, though still present, had softened into something gentler. Gratitude replaced sorrow, gratitude that she had left me with the strength to guide Emily, and gratitude that Emily herself had embraced the lesson. As the weeks slipped by, the graduation program I had carried for years no longer felt like a burden. It had once been a reminder of duty, of the weight I bore as both father and protector. One quiet afternoon, I opened a drawer in my study and placed it inside, not discarded, but laid to rest, like a chapter finally closed. I no longer needed a token to remind me of who I was or what I owed. The truth was already alive in the choices I had made. At sunset, Emily and I often sat together on the porch, the fields stretching before us in golden light. The horizon glowed with promise, each day ending in a blaze of color that seemed to cleanse the air of the past. We didn't speak much during those moments. Words felt unnecessary. The silence between us was not the silence of shame, but of peace. As the sun dipped lower one evening, I let my thoughts settle into clarity. Respect cannot be purchased with wealth or secured by titles. It is not granted by society's approval or by the sheen of polished shoes. True respect is lived, in truth, in dignity, and in the courage to stand tall when others try to make you small. That was the lesson the Reynolds family had never understood, and the lesson Emily now carried with her. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking beneath me, and let the evening air wash over my face. The world beyond the ranch might still buzz with gossip, but here, the fields whispered something different, something steady, honest, eternal. I had faced humiliation, and I had answered it not with fury, but with truth. And as the last light of day faded, I felt certain that was enough. In life, moments of humiliation can often feel like the end of dignity, as if the opinions of others define who we are. Yet what this story reminds us is that true worth has nothing to do with wealth, appearances, or the approval of society. Respect is not borrowed from those who mock or belittle us. It is rooted in the quiet certainty of truth and the resilience to hold steady even when others try to tear it away. There are times when silence can serve as a shield, protecting us from conflict and allowing us to rise above petty cruelty. But there also comes a moment when silence becomes complicity, when failing to act means surrendering our own self-respect. The measure of wisdom is knowing the difference. To endure with grace is powerful, but to speak with courage at the right time is transformative. This journey illustrates that power without humility crumbles quickly, while dignity grounded in truth endures. Pride built on arrogance is fragile. It collapses under the weight of its own illusions. But integrity, even when hidden in plain sight, possesses the strength to shatter falsehood and restore balance. In that contrast lies the ultimate lesson. Wealth can purchase admiration, but only character commands respect. It also speaks to the bond between generations. The greatest legacy is not measured in money or property, but in the values passed forward: dignity, courage, and the unwavering belief that no one should bow their head to cruelty. When we hold fast to these principles, we teach not only by words but by example, showing that resilience is more powerful than ridicule, and that truth, though sometimes quiet, is never powerless. In the end, the story is less about revenge than about renewal. It is about the way truth restores balance, how dignity reclaims its place, and how courage, once chosen, reshapes the path forward. It invites us to remember that life's storms do not define us. The way we stand in them does. And when the dust settles, what remains is not the echo of laughter at our expense, but the steady, unshakable knowledge that respect is found within and cannot be taken away. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.